Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Dr. Mark Calarco. I'm the National Medical Director of American Addiction Centers. Now, although I am the Medical Director of an addiction company, we are not going to be talking about addiction here. This is about optimal health for firefighters. And I'd like to just say that I'm honored to speak here, basically at a convention with members of such a noble profession. And the kind of occupation that we choose usually says a lot about our core values. Okay, so I've got a lot I'd like to share with you, so let's get started. I'd like to be able to, I wish I could come down here and walk and talk as I do, but apparently we don't have a remote, so I have to click as we go. Okay, quote from Hippocrates, about 400 BC. Those sages back in the day, they were pretty smart, and they pretty much had it right back then. Okay, first a few facts related to firefighters. 105 firefighters die annually from line of duty related causes, and sudden cardiac death accounts for 45% of that, which is the leading cause. You know, the physical stresses, the emotional stress, and of course all the environmental pollutants and exposures contribute to that. Obviously, those with cardiovascular risk factors are the highest risk for sudden cardiac death. And you know, here's the most common risk factors. Many of you are familiar with those: family history, hypertension, smoking, elevated cholesterol, advancing age, inactivity, and obesity. And despite the physical rigors and you know, the high prevalence of the physical rigors of the profession, there's a high prevalence of poor fitness, obesity, and cardiovascular disease among firefighters. So let me try to make this interactive. So true or false? High cholesterol causes cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and stroke. How many people think that's true? Anybody? How many people think it's false? How many people aren't sure? Okay. Well, actually, it's false. So cholesterol is just one factor. You know, many people can live their whole lives with very high cholesterol and never develop any cardiovascular disease. Non-menopausal women who still have cycles are at very low risk. They can smoke, drink, have high cholesterol, eat out every night, and they won't have a heart attack until they become menopausal, and then the risk is equal to a man of the same age and with the same risk factors. And then some people, you know, have normal cholesterol, and they die from heart attacks. And I'm sure we unfortunately know of people who fit that category. So what's going on with all this? It seems kind of enigma, a little bit hard to figure out. So what is going on? Well, there's been a paradigm shift in medicine based on research, and it comes down to the following: that inflammation is the underlying cause of virtually all cardiovascular disease. And furthermore, it's the cause of almost every chronic disease of humankind. So I'd like to go into this just a little bit. And I'd like to add that I'm going to be talking about major paradigms, kind of big principles that you can use for yourself and for you know, colleagues and employees. And I will obviously talk about some specific implementations, but I want you to have the big picture. So here's inflammation. As you can see, it's responsible for all these diseases at the core root. Basically all the things that we think about as being chronic diseases that afflict humankind. And so, you know, if you don't want to take my word for it, you can just follow the money. So billions of dollars have been spent on products that target the causes of inflammation. I listed a few there. I'm sure all of you have seen advertisements for things like Enbrel, Rituxan, Humira, Remicade. How many people have heard of those things? Yeah, most people, right? So all these pharmaceutical companies spending billions of dollars, and those products right there target inflammation. They're monoclonal antibodies that target the root of inflammation, and they're used for things like rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, psoriasis, and many other causes. Interestingly, though, even though they aren't FDA approved, everybody who takes those also has a lower risk for heart attack and stroke because of the inflammatory, the decreasing this inflammation. I want you to think of, when we talk about inflammation, most people think about sore joints, and that's true, but that's just one small aspect. Inflammation is really, I would like you to think of it more of like a corrosion or a rusting of the body. When you see like, you know, rust or corrosion on metals, the same process is going on in organic tissue in our body. And so we call it oxidative stress. It damages DNA, causes mutations, damages cell structures that lead to early demise and disease. And as I mentioned, not only affects the joints, but every tissue and cell in the body, including stem cells. And this is the latest research. It's not published. Well, you won't see it in the main media yet, but inflammation actually blunts stem cell production. Stem cells, for most people, if you don't know, those are responsible for replacing dead and dying cells in our body. And inflammation blunts that, and so prevents us from repairing in an adequate fashion. And then inflammation is only beneficial when it deals with acute issues, and it's detrimental when it's chronic. So for example, let's say you fall and you sprain your knee or your ankle. Most people have that experience. You know, you get a swelling, it gets hot, red, and that actually serves a function. First of all, it keeps you off the injured joint so that you don't injure it further. Also, it brings blood flow into the joint so that you can, the healing properties can heal it. If you don't get blood into an area, it cannot heal. So that's all well and good, and we want that. But you don't want that knee or ankle to be sore 6 months down the road, because if you do, then you're more likely to get degenerative arthritis and other chronic issues. So inflammation is good, should do its job, and then get out of Dodge. Genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors all play a role in inflammation. However, well, for most people, modern diet is the primary cause of increased inflammation. Now, with firefighters, they have some special situations where they deal with a lot of environmental hazards, so sometimes that could be first and foremost. But for most of the population in modern world, it is diet. And why is that so? Simply because we eat and drink basically every day, so it has a profound impact on our body temple. And so changes in processing of in agriculture, feeding of livestock, things like grain-fed versus grass-fed, a lot of refined oils and grains all contribute to inflammation in our body. Essentially, when we eat or drink these things, they cause certain chemicals you produce in our body, and they can increase inflammation, they can be inflammatory chemicals, or they can be anti-inflammatory chemicals. And with moderate diets, more often than not, it's inflammatory. So the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in modern foods has shifted from 1:1 to 10:1. Now, what does that mean? So traditionally, back in the day with our grandparents and maybe great-grandparents, everything was pretty much free-range, grass-fed, and we got the animals would eat a lot of omega-3s from plant sources, and then when we ate the meat, the dairy, and whatnot, that got passed along to us. Well, now we use to increase yields and to fatten up livestock. A lot more of animals are grain-fed, and those are very high in omega-6s. Omega-6s get converted to inflammatory molecules in the body, whereas omega-3s increase anti-inflammatory molecules. And so it used to be a 1:1 ratio. Now it's 10:1 in favor of the omega-6s. That pushes the equation towards a highly inflammatory state. If I took a random sampling of 1,000 people here in Denver, 990 would be inflamed. We can measure that, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Obviously, smoking, alcohol, and extreme physical exertion can all increase inflammation. Smoking is pretty obvious. When you smoke, it's free radicals going right into your lungs and then elsewhere. Alcohol also is toxic and causes free radicals in the liver and then spreads outward. And then people who do a lot of extreme physical exertion, for example, marathoners, triathletes, I have many people who do that, and I respect that. However, those kind of extreme physical exertion does accelerate the aging process and does increase inflammation and free radical formation, and they typically don't live as long. And then we have pollutants, chemicals, chemical exposure, combustion, radiation, and EMFs, which are electromagnetic fields. Now, all these things are really important. We have cosmic rays that pass through through the planet every day. We have radiation from various sources, including radon on your house and other places, electromagnetic fields that are generated by mostly electronic devices. We have about 1 million-fold more than we did just 10 years ago, and about 10 million more than we did 20 years ago. They're here to stay, of course, but we evolved, our species evolved in an electromagnetic field. And so it's going to affect us in one way, shape, or form. And I don't know if it's good or not. There's a lot of money on the table, so the debate's still there. Okay, so here's some recommendations for decreasing inflammation. Try to consume some fresh foods over processed foods. Typically, processed foods will have a lot of inflammatory agents in them, oils and other grains and things that are inflammatory in nature. Limit the intake of dairy and processed carbohydrates, especially gluten-rich grains. Now, I'm not saying you need to be gluten-free. I know there's kind of a fad with gluten. Some people need to be gluten-free. They have celiac disease, but that's really about 1% of the population. However, it is a continuum. So, for example, most people can tolerate some gluten, depending upon their ethnicity, where they came from, their ancestors. But every single one of us will take a hit if we take too much gluten. And we're right now in a society of gluten overload. It's in everything, even if you don't think it's, and gluten is typically in barley, wheat, and rye. It's inflammatory to the small bowel. Your body makes an immune reaction when you consume foods that contain gluten, and it inflames us. You may simply get some indigestion, but it could cause more serious things long term. But it definitely causes inflammation in humans. And our ancestors had very little of it. We consume it on a daily basis and in excess, and that increases our inflammatory burden. And then try to have at least one serving of fresh fruit and one serving of fresh vegetable daily. Try to choose organic if possible. You know, that seems like really reasonable, but at our eating disorder facility in Tennessee, we always survey people, do you have a serving of fruit and a serving of vegetable every day? And most people say no. You know, try to avoid most saturated and unpolyunsaturated fats. You can use things like virgin olive oil, medium chain coconut, expeller pressed organic canola oil are all good. Fats in a lot of avocados, walnuts, almonds, and many other nuts are excellent. And grass-fed and free-range and hunted proteins, if you're a hunter, sources are better than grain-fed. So yes, some of that food is a little more expensive. I just decided to vote with my wallet and continue to purchase those things when it becomes available. Therefore, eventually, if enough of us do that, then it drives the price down and makes it more affordable, and we're eating more like our ancestors ate. And try to consume 40 grams or more of fiber every day from all sources. Oatmeal is a great way to get started. I know it's somewhat boring, but it's really healthy. It has lots of other health benefits, but it does decrease total body inflammation. And most people with modern diet don't get enough fiber. That's why you see commercials for, you know, Metamucil and all the other laxatives out there on TV. Try to consume foods high in omega-3s, you know, like salmon, herring, sardines, black cod, flaxseed, hemp seed, and those eggs now that are fortified. If you're going to do a fish source, try to, you know, this is challenging. If it's pristine fish, it's perfect. But of course, our oceans aren't always pristine. There's mercury and PCBs. So you have to be careful where you get that, but in an ideal world, those are great sources. Also, consider omega-3 supplement. The thing about omega-3s, they are FDA approved for lowering triglycerides. So if you have high triglycerides and high cholesterol, they're beneficial, and there's prescription medications for that. Also, they lengthen your telomeres. Anybody familiar with that? So telomeres are little caps at the ends of our DNA, and they're like caps on the end of shoelaces, and they're long when we're young, and they get shorter and shorter as we get older. And when they get short enough they can't get any shorter, then the cell dies, and that's we get old and die that way. It accelerates the aging process and also leads to cancer. So things like omega-3s actually lengthen those, and so does exercise. And then magnesium citrate. Almost every man over 35 and every woman who's postmenopausal should probably take this, with few exceptions. It significantly lowers your risk for heart attack and stroke, significantly. And in fact, in the emergency room, when I used to do emergency medicine, sometimes people will come in with a heart attack, and you can't shock them out of it. If you don't use magnesium, they'll die. It's the only thing that will convert their arrhythmia. But you can get it as a non-prescription, and it's healthy. It's also a wonderful sleep aid. If you take it before bedtime, 400 to 500 milligrams, it really helps you sleep well, and also lowers, the citrate version also lowers kidney stone risk. And then there's anti-inflammatory herbs like turmeric and ginger, or supplement like Zyflamen, which is excellent. I don't own any stock in that company. It's a good product. If you're not allergic to aspirin, low-dose aspirin has its benefits for certain types of cancers and inflammation, and then the cancers that they cause. And then adequate sleep quality and duration. Now, this is usually a whole lecture. I could talk about this. And this can be challenging for first responders because of the sleep deprivation they go through at times. But humans evolved around a day-night cycle, okay? So we can go against that if we work 24/7, second shift, third shift, etc. But we do so at our own peril. And when I talk to people in other aspects of public safety, this is always a big issue. There's no way around it. We need to be available 24/7. I get it. However, you need to know you do take a hit. Because when you go to sleep at night, you have a lot of hormonal regulation. I'll touch upon that a little bit later. If you don't get the adequate sleep and it's not synced to the day-night cycle, it will have an adverse effect on the body. In fact, that's why people who work routinely for long periods of time, second and third graveyard shifts, they have significant increased risk of certain types of cancers. And then limit your exposure to environmental pollutants, radiation, EMFs. I mean, it's hard to get off the grid. I mean, everyone's going to live an Amish life. I get that. But especially for firefighters, you're exposed to a lot of these things as first responders. So you need to do really good about lowering the inflammation in the areas that you have control. But obviously, if you live next to a coal plant or a nuclear facility or something, it may not be the best. If you can have an opportunity to move somewhere where it's a little better without those environmental exposures, that, of course, is preferable. And then consider prescription medications if there's a strong genetic inheritance. You know, medicines, I don't know how this audience is, but, you know, I have people come to me, and some people don't want to take any medications for anything. I get, and I understand. No one wants to take a prescription, they don't have to. But some people got a real bad bag of goods from their ancestors, right? Probably got some good things, but some of us got bad things. Maybe real predisposition towards cancer, maybe really bad cholesterol. And sometimes no matter what you do, no matter how good your lifestyle is, you're still going to be at increased risk. That has to do with the genetic penetrance. So sometimes for a high cholesterol, for example, with a really bad LDL, some people need a statin medication or something similar. Okay, as long as they take CoQ10 to balance out its side effects, it might be actually beneficial. Incidentally, I'm not pushing it, but some people do benefit from that. It's the only way to get them to be healthy. Statins, by the way, do lower cancer risk because they do it through inflammation. And in fact, that's how they lower our cardiovascular risk. It was thought for a long time that when you took like a Lipitor or Zocor or Crestor, things of that sort, that it was lowering the cholesterol that lowered the cardiovascular risk, the heart attack and stroke risk. It's not really due to that. The major effect is due to its decrease in inflammation. Okay. So if any of you out there are on those, as long as you take CoQ10 to counteract it, it may not be a bad thing. And then I would say, you know, it's good to have a screening. A VAP is like it's called a vertical auto profile. It's like a cholesterol panel, only it looks at a lot more detail. So people who have a normal routine cholesterol panel can have a really bad VAP because it looks at a lot of intermediate particles, lipoprotein A, a lot of other things that you need to look at, you know, kind of look at the details to determine your cardiovascular risk. More of a genetic, it lifts up the rug and looks a little more detail. And then things like highly sensitive CRP, which measures inflammation and is a significant risk factor for heart attack and stroke. And then homocysteine, which deals with amino acid metabolism. High levels are also associated with increased stroke and heart attack, and there's all ways to treat those. This is Dr. Weil's anti-inflammatory pyramid. It's pretty good. Just want to show you. Did a good job with that. Just kind of showing the hierarchy of how we want to eat and drink. Okay, so the key point, inflammation is the underlying cause of virtually all chronic diseases of humankind. And decreasing total body inflammation through lifestyle intervention, mostly, will reduce the risk for everything, cancer, diabetes, you name it. Okay. Now, I'd like to move on to obesity and diabetes. And there's a world pandemic of diabesity, which is diabetes and obesity. It's a new word, you know, combined together. But we have diabetes and obesity even in third world countries now, like China and India, Africa. I mean, places where, you know, people, you don't think you get enough calories, but they are. 65% of Americans are either overweight or obese. I think many of you are aware of that. It affects all strata of society, rich or poor, regardless of your ethnicity. Firefighters are no exception. And over 40% of firefighters are obese. And the trend has been upward in the last decade. So there's been an increase in firefighters in class 2 and class 3 obesity, which is it says class 2 and class 2. It should be class 2 and class 3, so the higher levels of obesity. And obese firefighters are at increased risk for cardiovascular disease, that's CVD, of course, diabetes, cancer, and on-duty injuries. And obese firefighters have 5 times more likely to have an injury compared to their normal weight colleagues. Eliminating obesity in firefighters would estimated result in 60% fewer musculoskeletal injuries, and obviously significant cost savings from fewer workers' compensation and lost time work. Interestingly, female firefighters on average have better body composition than their male colleagues, but they also have high rates of tobacco use. So true or false? Okay. Being a few pounds overweight is actually healthier than being normal weight since it gives you a reserve in case you get sick. Okay, I'm setting you up. Anybody want to hazard and say yes? No? Okay. All right. False. Research shows that even being overweight or even in class 1 obesity, which is the least obese class, it increases your all-cause mortality. And all-cause mortality means dying from heart attack, stroke, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, autoimmune diseases, etc. In fact, going from normal weight to overweight increases all-cause mortality by up to 20%. And going from overweight to obese increases up to 50% or more, depending upon the severity. You know, and also your waist size matters. It's an independent risk factor. So the bigger your waistline, the higher the risk of mortality, independent of your BMI or other factors. Men with a waist size of more than 35 inches have an increased mortality, all-cause mortality by 16%, and women greater than 27.5 have a 25% increased risk. And this increased mortality is due to the hormonally active nature of body fat. And I'd like to just touch upon that briefly. Fat is a storage form of calories, right? So each pound of fat that you have is 2 meals, all right? 2 meals. Each pound of fat is 2 meals. However, it just doesn't sit there on your body. It produces hormones. Now, in both men and women, body fat produces estrogen, okay? For women, maybe it's not a bad thing, but in men, not such a good thing because it's feminizing. It also causes health issues in men. But if you see people with man boobs and things of that sort, a lot of times that's due to high estrogen levels as they gain obesity. And so this causes, also the increased estrogen in men causes prostate disorders and other health issues, not to mention mood. Also, it produces things called inflammatory cytokines, and this is true for both men and women. So body fat produces these inflammatory cytokines. They increase total body inflammation. And so this is why if your weight goes from normal to overweight, or overweight to obese, you're increasing your inflammatory burden. So your body is becoming more inflamed just simply as a result of the excess body fat, irregardless of all the other factors that I discussed briefly. And that is why your all-cause mortality goes up, because remember I said that inflammation is the underlying cause of all chronic diseases of humankind. So as inflammation goes up due to increased body fat, so does your all-cause mortality and your risk for all those diseases. True or false? Obesity can be caused by hormonal imbalances. Who says true? Come on, somebody. Anybody? Who thinks it's false? Sometimes true. Okay, and I'm an expert, a hormonal expert, so this is right up my alley. I love this. Many people cope that their weight loss is due to a hormonal problem. Not always true. We can dispel that if it's not the case. Then we can work on what's really going on. However, about 50% of our clients at our eating disorder clinic do have what I like to call hormonal headwinds. And as we get older, our metabolism tends to decline, and we tend to have a decline in key hormones as well. And here's some common hormonal conditions: sex hormone imbalances, thyroid dysfunction, adrenal hormone abnormalities, growth hormone deficiency, sleep cycle hormones, and polycystic ovarian syndrome, which affects only females. So there's a lot of hormones that are involved with that. It's beyond the scope of our lecture, but I'm happy to answer any questions regarding that later. But all these things are really common. You know, why check for them? Well, if you don't look, you won't find them. We have people come in who have really good, conventional medical care, but they don't specifically look for these, for these key hormonal indicators that can change as we age. And if you don't know that you have them, well, you're going to have health ramifications. Clients with undiagnosed problems, they'll struggle, they'll get discouraged, and they'll become sick. And I would say that you can't just assume it only happens in older people. I think that's a problem. When I educate a lot of other physicians in hormones, I let them know that as opposed to a decade ago when only people came to see me were people in their 40s and older, now I see people in their late teens, early 20s and beyond who have hormonal disruption, some kind of abnormalities. And it's much more common than it used to be. So you never assume just because there's a young person there, whether it's you or somebody you know, that they're normal. It's a lot more, there are a lot more abnormalities. And it has to do, probably the major reason for this is that we have a lot of hormone disruptors in our environment, okay? So technology has a lot of good things, but it's a double-edged sword sometimes. So let me go on and just talk a little bit more about causes of obesity, aside from hormones. Humans cope really well with scarcity. We're really good about that because we evolved around scarcity. All our ancestors had very little resources to work with, and they made the most of it. But we're not so good with abundance, and that has to do with the way our brains evolved. And so we have these primitive brain survival instincts that override common sense. So even if you had 3 meals a day plus a couple of snacks and you're full, if you see your favorite dessert in front of you, chocolate cake or something, chances are we might eat it anyway even if we don't need it. And that's just because our ancestors had very few resources, and if they could get as many resources as possible, as quickly as possible, they were more likely to survive. you know, and so it's a survival mechanism. Of course, today in our society, we have lots of resources, so we don't need that behavior anymore, but unfortunately, it's hardwired into our primitive brain, and it's hard to break. And when we deal with eating disorders and other things, this becomes a real problem. And then we have the satiety hormones versus the hunger hormones. You know, we have hormones that make us feel full, and we have hormones that make us feel hungry. How many of you have been up late at night, you know, maybe 11, 12, 1 o'clock a.m., and you see all those food commercials, right? You see those? And first of all, you should notice that you don't see any green. They're all like brown. It's pizzas and burgers and fries and all that kind of stuff. You don't see any color, any organic color, but they target that. There's a reason why they have all those. They have them on during the day, but more at night. You'll notice late at night. And that's because we have a hunger hormone called ghrelin, which starts to peak into midnight. And it doesn't matter what you ate, whether or not you've received enough calories during the day, that hormone kicks in and makes you hungry. So they know that, and that's why they target it. So we have that hormone. But we also have hormones that make us feel full, called cystokinin and adiponectin. There's lots of them. And, you know, so but with the diabetes that we have and the fact that 65% of Americans are overweight or obese, why are the hunger hormones winning? So I'd like to just touch upon that now. We have this dichotomy between modern diet and genetic heritage. We had the introduction of agriculture and dairy products about 12,000 years ago, and then it was very inefficient. There was no storage. It rotted very quickly. So for most of our existence as modern humans, 300,000 to 500,000 years, we basically were hunter-gatherers. We ate lots of protein, you know, and fat that went with the protein, and a lot of fiber in roots, nuts, berries, whatever we could find. We didn't have any processed foods, and we had very little carbs. If you found a honeycomb, you like winning the lottery. And I was like, whoa. And any carb source, in fact, was considered would significantly increase your chances of survival, because we had very little of it. And if you found a carbohydrate source, you didn't have to work hard to get the calories. So anybody who hunts or gardens, you know there's a lot of work involved in getting the calories back. The benefit, you have to work really hard to get the calories, whereas if you find blueberry bushes or honeycomb, you got calories without having to work at all. So we have a survival mechanism that has us really crave carbohydrates and sweet things in general. And you can see it in children, right? If you let your, I don't know, I have kids, I don't know if you have kids. If you let them eat ding-dongs all day, they probably would, right? I mean, you know, we know they're not supposed to do that, and we as adults know we're not supposed to do that, but we have an innate desire for carbohydrates, carbohydrates are just long-chain sugars, so for sugar, in other words. And that's why we have that drive. Our body recognizes proteins, fats, and fiber very well. When we eat those things, we feel full. But not so much with carbohydrates and processed foods. So modern processing, you know, when we take something and we manipulate it, we break down its bonds. What we do is we can make it very calorie dense, but it doesn't trigger the satiety hormones like traditional foods do. You know, a classic example, and here's one here, volume versus, so chicken breast versus slice of pizza. Let me talk about that. So if people here are on a vegetarian, if you like chicken and I prepared you your chicken breast any way you liked it, grilled, baked, whatever you like, how many could eat more than one or two? Anybody? Okay, how many most people eat one or two, right? Is that correct? Who could eat three or more? Okay. Now let's talk about pizza. How many of you can eat 3 or more pieces of pizza? All right. So they have the same caloric content, more or less. But the reason why we can eat, the chicken breast is very dense. It's a very dense protein source, and our body recognizes that food very well. And so it kicks in the satiety hormones and makes us feel full. But pizza, it's a processed food, right? I'm not saying you can have it in occasionally, but it's very processed, so we can eat a lot before our body recognizes it and makes us feel full. So highly processed foods kind of slip in the back door. And for people who don't have an eating disorder, if we were full after one piece of pizza, we would stop. But the problem is we aren't full after one piece of pizza, so we keep eating until we are full. By that time, you've taken excess calories as opposed to foods that our body would traditionally recognize. Remember, pizza hasn't been around very long. Chicken's been around in one form or another for millennia. So, and then we have a lot of highly processed foods and things like sodas and alcohol, especially anytime you drink your calories. I mean, we got people who are addicted to Mountain Dew and other sodas at our facility. They can drink 96 ounces a day, easy. And I can understand that because after all, it doesn't kick in any hormones to make you feel full. You can drink it a lot, right? It's not filling. And alcohol's the same way. Alcohol's a pure carb. It's the same thing. So essentially what we have is a disconnect. Our bodies are living at about 10,000 years ago, and fast forward today, our diets have changed so radically in the last 50 years. So when I was a kid, so I'm 53, so when I was a kid, we had one McDonald's like 20 miles away, and if I was really good, like once a month, folks would take me out there and we'd have something, right? Now, we got access to fast foods like around the block everywhere we go, okay? And our lifestyles have changed, a lot of people are busy, and we tend to eat out rather than at home. We didn't have those options back in the day. Our parents or grandparents, they used to cook most everything we had, and it was less refined. I want to talk about sugar and health just a moment. So our ancestors, yours and mine, all of us, all of ours, they went around with blood sugar averaging less than 85 milligrams per deciliter. Modern blood sugar today is considered 65 to 100. But I want to talk about why that's not really considered normal. So we know that, in fact, we know our ancestors went around with those low blood sugars because anthropologists would follow hunter-gatherer tribes and measure their blood sugar and see what they ate. But also we know it through coprolites. Anybody know what a coprolite is? So a coprolite is fossilized human poop. And so, anthropologists, I guess, some people, they go for it. They are able to determine the kind of diets that our ancestors ate. And they were very low in carbohydrates. And if they needed to make blood sugar for any reason, for hunting or survival, we just made it from the liver. Well, today, in modern human societies, non-diabetic people run around with blood sugars from 103 to 117. And we can determine that by hemoglobin A1C. I'm sure some of you have had that test. Basically, it gives me a 3-month snapshot of what your blood sugar is doing. So it's better than a point in time and a finger stick, which is affected by what you just ate. The hemoglobin A1C is not like that. I can tell what your blood sugars have been doing for the past 3 to 4 months. So it's a very good indicator. And we're all running sweet. And the concept is similar to blood pressure guidelines. Okay, when I first started medicine 22 years ago, if you had a blood pressure of 180 over 110, we'd say, just take it easy. Go a little bit easy. Now we go like, what the heck, it's not acceptable at all. And as you know, over time, we've dropped that blood pressure down from, it used to be, couldn't be over 180 over 10, then it was 160 over 100, now it's 140 over 90, and it's going lower, I guarantee it, right? It'll probably be 130 over 80 or somewhere whereabouts. Blood sugar is very similar to that. We allow blood sugar values that we consider normal. They aren't really physiological normal for our species. We go around with much too high blood sugars. So why is that a problem? Well, excess carbs, they can cause diabetes and obesity, but they also accelerate the aging process. And they do it so by a concept called glycation. Is anyone familiar with the term? Okay, good. So this is something you're going to hear about in the future quite a bit because it's really considered by biogerontologists. It's probably one of the top 7, 8 factors that age the human body. And so let me put it in terms that you all know. When you celebrate Thanksgiving, if you have a turkey, when you prepping the turkey, you know how the skin on the turkey before you put it in the oven, it's all pliable and soft. It's like rubber band. And then when you put it in the oven and you baste it, it comes back all brown and crinkly and tastes good, right? That's caramelization, right? But it's also glycation. So that process is going on in our human bodies all the time. And so, because our bodies are warm, right? 97 to 99 degrees, plus or minus a little bit. And we have blood sugar in us all the time. We have to have some. So when you have heat plus blood sugar, it causes a chemical reaction called glycation that forms cross-links or bindings with proteins and fats in our body. Okay, so what does it look like? How many people have seen cataracts? Cataracts, right? Those little you see white opacities on the eyes. That is glycation right then and there. So diabetics, they get cataracts much faster than normal people. And they get a lot of other diseases. So diabetes is really an accelerated form of aging in terms of glycation. Anybody who's diabetic, they can get neuropathy, right? Or they get pain in their legs, and it damages their nerves. They can't heal. It damages their blood vessels, so that when they get hit down the leg, they get ulcers that don't heal. They go blind, right? They lose their kidneys, and they have increased risk for heart attack and stroke. It's all due to glycation, this process. So let's talk about some therapeutic modalities for preventing obesity, diabetes, and glycation. Well, first of all, it's important on the glycemic index. And basically what this glycemic index is, and there's going to be a chart in a moment I'll show you, it basically rates every food, gives it a number, and the higher the number, the faster it becomes blood sugar in your body. And they've actually taken volunteers and measured them. They give them foods, and they measure their blood sugar at intervals. You want foods that don't become sugar very quickly, Because when that happens, if you eat a processed food like a soda or alcohol, and it becomes or French bread for that matter, when you eat something like that that has a high glycemic number, it becomes blood sugar very, very quickly, unless you're dying, of course, or you need it in an emergency. But normally, that's not favorable, because when that happens, it shocks your pancreas to release insulin, and then insulin, basically what it does is it brings your blood sugar back down to normal. But in doing so, it increases inflammation, okay? And also blocks your body's ability to break down fat. If you have high blood sugars, and you constantly are shocking your pancreas with foods that become sugar very quickly, it's very hard to lose weight, and because you're blocking the hormones that break down fat. And obviously the opposite occurs. You put on body fat and then increase risk for diabetes. So I'll show you the glycemic index in a moment. It's extremely important, and we use that at our facility. Physical activity, of course, I think you all know that's really important. Do you know that if you just did one vigorous workout a week, just one, I'm not saying one's enough, but if you did just one, you could lower your type 2 diabetes risk by 30%. So physical activity makes your body more sensitive to insulin and lowers blood sugar. All our ancestors were physically active people. Sedentary lifestyle, we are not designed that way. Most of our jobs now require a lot of with some exceptions, firefighters on the first line, obviously, but we sit around, we look at computers, we drive, we have a lot of sedentary activity, and that is not how we were designed. And then there's things like eating attunement and other behavioral therapies. Eating attunement we use for people who have an eating disorder, but it's actually useful for everyone. In its simplest form, I'm going to tell you what it is. Eating attunement is, and if you want to try this, I recommend trying it. Chew every bite of food 32 times. Every bite of food 32 times. We have protocols and things for our people who need that, but try it. See how long you go. It works. It helps normalize body weight. It does it because it causes physiological changes that are favorable in the gut and the stomach and all the muscles involved, and helps your hunger and satiety hormones to be in balance. Helps your satiety hormones, gives them time to react, to make you feel full. And then there's medications and CR mimetics. Medications, there are medications that can help obviously lower blood sugar, that help prevent lower glycation. One good example is metformin. It's a diabetes medication, but I prescribe it for people who are not diabetic. Incidentally, it also lowers cancer risk and has some other benefits. There's also things like acarbose. And then there's non-prescription things like resveratrol, which comes from red grapes and knot root. That's a CR mimetic. Things like that, they actually lower your blood sugar. And so there's a lot of research in that. They do it modestly, but so obviously companies are trying to patent that and tweak the molecule so they can make it more effective. But for some people, those are necessary. Okay, here's the glycemic index. First of all, I want you to notice something. There's glycemic load on the left, but let's just stick with glycemic index. And you'll notice that if you look under, this is table sugar right here, 68. Popcorn, watermelon, whole wheat flour, bread, Cheerios, shredded wheat, potatoes, and cornflakes all have higher numbers, which means they're more sugary than table sugar. So I have a lot of clients that say, I don't like desserts. I don't eat a lot of sugary things. So I ask them, you ever have a bowl of cereal after dinner? Oh, yeah. It's like, have some cereal. Well, you might as well just be eating chocolate cake, okay? So I'm telling you, most of our box cereals that we have are like eating a dessert. And for those of us who are parents, I just want you to be mindful of the fact that you're giving your kid chocolate cake for breakfast. I'm not saying once in a while they can't have Captain Crunch, just so they don't feel like they're deprived. I don't want them to be deprived kids, but I want you to know that that's really not very wholesome. It's very high glycemic, and it does increase the risk for diabetes and obesity. So we use this as a guideline, and you can Google it, and you can find. I'm not suggesting you memorize all the numbers like I have, but to be mindful of what's low glycemic index. In general, if I go to a party or I'm invited to a special event, I just walk around. They have a buffet, and I go, would my ancestors recognize that food? If the answer is no, it's probably processed, and you probably don't want too much of it. Okay? If they do recognize it, then go for it, and that'll give you some, because it's probably going to be a low glycemic index food. So as a general rule, if it's not recognizable, moderate it. Okay. Key point. Excessive carbohydrate intake accelerates aging and causes obesity and diabetes. Maintaining body fat at a healthy level and focusing your eating habits using the guidelines will promote a healthier body and a longer life. Try to eat foods that you are genetically designed to eat. Low glycemic index foods, foods that you recognize that your ancestors would recognize. You know, it'll trigger your Sayedee hormones, your fullness hormones, and you'll feel well fed, but you won't eat as much. And you'll have increased energy, healthier gut, and optimal weight. Okay, finally, I'm going to talk about some psychosocial issues. After all, I do work for American Addiction Centers. So, you know, especially in your profession as firefighters, and you know, I understand that being working with public safety, and also I've been an emergency room physician for a long time in the past. You know, you need to have good stress reduction techniques to deal with the stress of the job. And you want to maintain, you know, a healthy body tempo, you know, which will in turn promote a healthy mental and spiritual outlook, what I like to call the Holy Trinity of mind, body, spirit. I mention this only because we're all spiritual beings, okay? I am focusing on the body tempo because it's something we can measure a little more objectively, but I don't want to underestimate the importance of spirituality in our lives and our social networks. Okay, so firefighter facts. Tobacco use, about 14%. Firefighters, less than comparable military occupational group. And they always use military personnel. I'm not sure how accurate that is, comparing you guys to military personnel, but that's what they do in the research. 70% use smokeless tobacco. Cigarette smokers, current or past users, have a higher risk of all injuries, statistically, okay? And smokers are more likely to have anxiety and problems related to alcohol also. We're talking about all firefighters now. The average firefighter drinks about 10 days per month, and 50% have 3 or more drinks, with about 50% reporting binge drinking. 10% report driving intoxicated in the previous 30 days. PTSD rate among professional firefighters is between 4 and 8%. For volunteers, it's significantly higher. Interestingly enough, the frequency of the trauma exposure doesn't predict your symptoms. What really predicts whether or not a firefighter will have PTSD, like something after 9/11, has to do with their the amount of social support and their self-esteem. And those are the greatest predictors of PTSD. And interestingly enough, I did a literature review. All these other countries, like Japan and Germany and Iran even, they all came to the same conclusions, which I thought was interesting. Okay, sleep deprivation, alcohol use, low physical activity, and nicotine use all correlate positively with increased risk for PTSD and other psychopathology. And people with high resilience resources, I like to call it, like mindfulness, they have a good optimism, good personal mastery, and good social support, all have lower rates, regardless of the frequency and the type of traumatic events that they had to deal with in their professional career. And so there's really this recurring theme of the level of social support, the level of physical activity, tobacco use, and alcohol use. Those are kind of the key risk factors you want to look for as red flags among your colleagues or your subordinates. Here's, this is from Carey. It's a recent research, kind of shows in percentages what I just kind of went over, the various psychosocial characteristics of firefighters. You can see that sleep deprivation and binge drinking are way up there, and everything. Some things are really low, like caffeine overuse and social bonding wasn't too bad. Pretty good physical well-being, but you know, those are kind of the best statistics we have on your profession. So in summary, firefighters who regularly use tobacco and alcohol, lack social support, and who are not physically active are at increased risk for work-related injury, PTSD, and other psychosocial problems, regardless of trauma exposure. So those in leadership positions should look for these red flags and consider early intervention. Okay. Buddha sums it up. I don't need to say any more. Okay, thank you very much.